It's great to have Amy back with us again. She's been teaching and still at UNT.
Well, no, actually, I teach at Dallas College, FCS Clearworks and Garland Creative Arts Center in Dallas.
Okay, now, okay. And the last time she did the wonderful slip trailing, we enjoyed that. So today we have an expert to tell us what we're doing wrong with glazing or what we are doing right with glazing. So, Amy, take it away. She's going to glaze 4 different items here, and hopefully we'll learn a lot. Thank you, Amy.
My pleasure. I'm going to try to use a variety of techniques, both layering and kind of placing glazes in different zones of the pot using different tools to give you a lot of scope in terms of how to use various resist methods and application methods to kind of build up depth of surface using just glaze. Because it has a lot of scope, really, unless you're using underglaze, in which case you're kind of relegated to transparency. Okay, so the first piece that I'm going to glaze is going to be a little bit of a simpler technique as far as I have glazes on different regions of the pot, not as much layering, and then I'll move into some more layering techniques on the others that I brought. I'm going to start by using masking tape as a resist to define the different zones that I'm going to do, because when you put the masking tape on the pot, it does not kind of put a residue or a surface on there that you can't remove. When you use wax on the bisque, it's stuck, right? You can't get rid of it. You have to run it through the kiln again to burn it out. So if you use tape, when you peel it off, that surface is fresh and clean and ready to glaze. So you can get glazes on different parts without overlapping them, full depth, and not have to worry about where your glaze is overlapping with the brush because you've defined your edge. So it's less of a concern about making sure you line the brush up perfectly every time. So the top part of this mug and the interior are going to be one glaze color, and then I'm going to do a different one around the bottom. I really like to use painter's tape if I have a choice as far as the masking tapes that are on offer, because it's less likely to leave a residue unless it's dusty, in which case rinse it off first and then apply your tape. Yeah, and that's another thing with glazing. When you're applying glaze, if there's a lot of dust on your piece, it can kind of create like a surface. It's a little bit like ball bearings, where the glaze will kind of peel away from that spot where it's too dusty. So you want to make sure that your surfaces are clean and free of dust when you're applying glazes for that reason. And you kind of can pull this tape pretty tight because it has a little bit of stretchable qualities. So you can kind of stretch it over that surface. And then you, of course, want to press it down, burnish it with your finger pads to get it stuck really well, particularly at the leading edge where the glaze is going to come up to it, so that it kind of doesn't have any undercuts where it'll kind of poke underneath. You can always scrape them off, but the less of them, the less cleanup you'll have to do at the end. So I've got that wrapped, and then I'm also going to go around the base of this handle here, because it's going to be the same color as the top of the mug. I've gotten some guidance about some of your glazes that are either new, so I'm going to try to use those to give you some good scope for when they're finished. I brought all cone 6 stoneware pieces so y'all could fire them here and finish them and have those as reference objects. A little bit of dust, you can either use water or you can kind of brush it out. This one hasn't been sitting too long, but I'm just going to make extra sure. It's really important with glazes that you mix it up really well. Older glazes, emulsifiers, the deflocculants, the kind of gums, the things they put in them to make it getting more settling in the glaze. The glaze is older and is settled. Just make sure you take the time to mix it up really well. Homogeneous glazes, it's really important because some things settle faster than others. And as far as what you have to set up, I mean, you need to have brushes to glaze. You need to have a sponge of some kind. You're also going to need to have things to scrape, right? So if you get the glaze kind of going past the point where you want it, so you can go back and clean up any overlaps. And then using the largest brush that you possibly can is pretty important, because that way you can kind of get as much on there as possible. This one is pretty thick, nice creamy glaze, so I don't think I need to use my super fluffy brush. I might use that for a glaze that's a little bit more watery. This one that's a little bit flatter is nice and wide, but it's not going to hold quite as much medium, which for how thick this glaze is, I think is going to be just right. So when you're applying glazes, a lot of these are designed to be brushable, so they've put gums and mediums in there to kind of make the glaze spreadable, so you have to use less water, so it smears well, and it makes your brush not dry out quite as fast. When the glaze starts to dry, you're going to encounter that, where it kind of wants to drag on itself, and it'll dry a lot faster the more layers you apply, so that first layer goes on really well, and then the successive layers, if your brush isn't loaded enough, or it's kind of like too dry, or the glaze is soaking out water a lot faster, because they vary a little bit. Some of them dry really fast on the second coat. Others, you have a little bit of a workable phase. Kind of depends on how it's formulated. I think different companies are going to vary there. But you could try kind of using a slightly wetter brush, or just try to use a brush that's loaded with a little bit more glaze. You can also go back when you have those pits, and you can rub the dry glaze down to blend it into, like, let's say you have tiny little pockets of air, those pinholes that form as it's drying. If those happen, you can rub to fill them. You can also take a small brush and go right to that pock mark and dab a little glaze there, and then rub it down with a dry finger to kind of heal it up, to even it out, because you can always reapply it. Oh, after it's already fired? That sounds kind of more like a glaze flaw, and honestly, I don't know if that's something you can always fix, because what's happening then is when the piece is firing, it's off-gassing, right? It's releasing steam, it's releasing air from inside, and then what's supposed to happen is when the glaze melts, it's supposed to heal those things back over, but if the glaze doesn't have any movement at all when it's molten, they'll just stay put. Um, so it's the kind of thing you can't usually fix it on that piece. You might be able to lay a little bit of maybe a clear glaze on top of it and refire it like a thin veneer, and that might be enough to kind of heal it up. Or the glaze that's missing, you could dab a little bit in that spot and air dry it. Sometimes if you hit the surface of the pot with a little bit of cheap hairspray, it makes it a little tacky, and you can get a little bit of glaze applied in an area to kind of refire and correct it. But it's also something to take account of, that if you do that combination again, you might want to skin it with a glaze that's a little bit runnier or a little bit of clear or a celadon to help it be a little bit more molten when it gets fired, so that those pinholes can seal back over when it melts. This one is a fresh glaze, which means it has great brushability. Older glazes, the gums and the deflocculants, the things that they use to make them stable and to make them brushable, they don't last forever. They have a lifespan. They get worse. So when glazes are fresh is when they're going to behave the best. And as they get older, that kind of quality about them can degrade.
And you just put one coat of that on?
I did two. So I put the one coat on, and then I went back around closer to the bottom and put the other, because I'm going to have the other glaze that I put on overlap a little bit.
Oh, okay.
So I did
So
kind of
what,
like
the
I
other one
stopped
will
right
drip
about
down?
here, and then I went up most of the way with the other, so that I could have a little bit of overlap. Because I don't necessarily want them to meet right at the edge. I want them to kind of be separated, but then also have some overlap, so you have 3 different zones. And then this one is the Tangelo Amico C65. It's another one of the Celadons, so it's going to also be transparent. So there will be a nice kind of relationship in terms of the transparency and the shine. So it'll kind of be a color relationship where you're not mixing visual textures, which can be another way to kind of build up some visual depth. And I always have a towel when I'm in the studio all the time. You'll maybe have already learned this, but you want something to dry your tools, to dry your hands, to keep them clean. Because you don't want to take a dirty hand covered in glaze and grab the piece and kind of put fingerprints of a different color on there. Yeah, I tend to overlap them if they're going to fully incorporate. Like if you're using 2 transparent clear glazes, they're pretty much going to merge together. But if you're using kind of glazes with more different personalities, you might want to try mixing them together in small quantities so that you consume everything that you've mixed. Right, so try to do a little at a time, or how much you think you need. Just pay attention to what ratio you used, right? Because it'll matter whether it's 25-75 one way, or about 50-50, or 25-75 the other way, because that's the way you might want to build your gradient, is by doing portions with a gradually increasing ratio. It's also the kind of thing you could test out on a tile before you get there, to make sure that it's working the way you want, especially if you're using glazes, because like the Celadons, they'll cohabitate fine, but if you're trying to go from a satin to a shiny, that might take a little bit more testing to get it just right. And you still will probably overlap it somewhat to soften the transition. I got the inside of this handle, but not the outside. I have a little bit of that overlap relationship at the top of this handle. So I'll stop a little shot. And you can see all my glaze brushes are pretty much the same kind of thing. Like they're super soft bristles. These ones are new, but get it wet and get it started.
Use a fan brush?
You can use fan brushes. The only issue I find with the fan brushes is they don't tend to hold a whole lot of medium. So you won't be able to cover a lot of ground unless it's one of the fan brushes that's really fluffy and thick. Like the oil painting ones that kind of have the stiff bristle, you won't be able to hold that much glaze in it. So I tend to favor the brushes that are kind of softer and fluffier, because they can hold a lot of that glaze to kind of spread it on the surface. And when they're softer, then when you're going back over that coat to even it out, they won't push the glaze away, but they'll take it where it's thicker and wetter and kind of diffuse it a little bit better. The stiff brushes, if you go over the glaze while it's too wet, they can just kind of push the glaze off of that surface, which is less desirable. Okay, so that one is good there. And then this is the Tangelo. And then right here at the rim, just to make sure that it's not too thin, because your rim is always going to be the spot where it wants to be the thinnest, I tend to dab it on with the side of the brush, so I won't have to go back and do a second coat. And typically, if you are doing a thicker coat, you're going to want to do it closer to the top of the piece, so if it does run, it has some room to go before it's going to get to the bottom. So if you're using a glaze you know is runny, and you're going to put it on the outside of the piece, and it's not something that's horizontal, right? So vertical things are going to want to run more than horizontal things. You probably don't want to go any more than a third to halfway down the exterior of the object, so that if it's going to run, it has an opportunity to do so without running onto the shelf and therefore ruining the shelf and your piece. It's also important as you go to be attentive to how the glaze goes on. You want the glaze to be fully occluding the visual texture of the clay underneath. If you put your glaze on so thin that you can still kind of see the texture of the clay underneath, like there's a translucency to it, you haven't put on enough. And when it fires, while it may seal the surface, you won't get the color effect that is being promised on the test tile or the bottle. So I overlapped the glazes, but I'm also going to the point at which that overlap begins, and that's where the second coat of this glaze will start, because I want them to overlap a little bit, but then I want the area where the rim was single glazed to kind of get that second coat, so it has a good color result. Typically, unless it's a glaze that's really watery, in which case you may have to build up a little bit more. So I kind of took that relationship over the top of the handle as well, because I think it'll be nice to kind of have it continue all the way around the top. Oftentimes it's either too thick or too thin, because it's like you don't know yet the relationship that the glaze has to the clay. And sometimes too, especially if you're using bottled glazes, experimentation and then actual experience of doing it is the best teacher. Because you can certainly have all the best intentions and put it on correctly and still not get the kind of desired result. So you have to accept that you may have to test it, right? So you can either have some pieces that you're willing to sacrifice to try something new on, or you can just kind of know that you're going to be learning a lot as you go. Because a lot of these things, especially if you're layering glazes, that relationship isn't going to be immediately apparent. You have to kind of experiment to learn it. It's a little trickier, I think, with bottled glazes because they are designed with gums to stabilize the raw coat. So even if they're applied too thickly, they won't necessarily crack, which is usually a dead giveaway that it's too thick. When you see cracking, it's telling you it's too heavy, right? Especially if it's trying to flake off. But because these have gums in them to kind of stabilize, they tend not to do that. So then what you're looking at is just coats where you're looking at it and you see a lot of different thicknesses. You see kind of lumpy areas, you see grooves, you see dry patches where it's kind of chunky and piled up next to a thinner spot. What you're going for is uniform thickness throughout. That's going to give you the best possible result, except for in cases of things like the crystal glazes that have chunks in them. Chunks are chunks, they're going to poke out. But that's what you're going for. And then if you come to a glaze and you see that it has like a really high drip, you can kind of go in and shave it down if rubbing it won't do the trick, right? Because you can always rub it, kind of break it down and kind of mix that powder. But you can also go to surfaces where it's thicker and lightly shave it down to kind of get it to match, so that it's kind of uniform. So those areas where you get like a really deep kind of chunky edge where you kind of reapply it a little too much, but it was too dry and it just kept getting pebbled up, you can just shave it down with the side of a dull blade or the side of a needle tool or a metal rib, and then just use very light pressure and do it gradually. Because if you apply a lot of pressure, you can kind of flake it off. So just light shaving pressure. And then you can kind of get that powder to fall into your water or make sure that you clean it up with a dry sponge afterwards. Okay, so with this one, the glaze is all applied on the handle and over the top and inside of the piece. So I'm going to wax around the areas where the tape is before I peel the tape. So when I apply the other glaze, it has a resist where they're kind of meeting, and then I'll wax the foot at the same time. I mean, I'm not going to dip it in wax because I have to target apply it, but if you had like a shallow dish of wax, you could just kind of dip your foot and get that wax that's at the same level all the way around. That is a possibility. But for this one, I need to kind of get a ring of wax around the bottom of this handle and around the base of the piece here, so that when I apply the next glaze, there's a resist. And you want to do this before you peel the tape so you don't accidentally get the wax where you don't want it. It will be, yeah. There's going to be very little overlap. Basically, it'll only be overlapped by about the thickness of the edge of the tape. So it's enough to make the glazes meet and not have a bald spot, but not enough for there to be any significant overlap. So this is a good technique to use if you want the glazes to come up and meet each other without overlapping. Yeah, I'm just basically doing it, I'm not perfectly pristine, but about an inch up all the way around. So that way I have plenty of egress. So as I'm brushing the other glaze, if it overlaps, I have enough wax to kind of make sure it doesn't stick, and then enough time to kind of clean up where it beads up. There are very few glazes that I've met where applying wax over the top of them kind of messes them up. The glazes where you have to be careful is if you encounter chinos. Sometimes when they dry, they form a microcrystal on the surface as part of the drying process. And if you put wax on top of those, it can kind of press it down and damage it. But other than that, no, all the other glazes are not going to have a problem with it that I've encountered. So the trick is that I've already put glaze down. So then when I put this wax on here, it's not going to be bald clay. It's just going to control the overlap. You don't really want to touch where you wax it, especially if there's glaze down, because where that wax is, it's a little tacky, right? Even when it's dry. So if you grab it where it's waxed, like as not, it might stick to your finger and pick the wax off in that spot. So you want to try to touch the piece and hold on to it where the wax isn't, or leave a spot where you can kind of handle it. And then I have this foot ring that's not perfectly round because I fluted it to match the top of the rim. So I'm going to go in. I always hold pieces sideways when I'm applying wax to feet like this so that I can watch the departure line where the glaze is going to go into the foot ring and really poke the brush into the grooves. Yeah, I mean, because you could always sponge it off, but the advantage of waxing the foot is that where your glaze finish is being applied, it's at kind of like when you kind of come up to the tape, it's that full thickness. You don't have a kind of tapering in the thickness of the glaze. It's all the way full thickness till you get to right where it meets at the foot. And then when I do the bottoms, I tend to hold the brush sideways so I don't accidentally push the bristles down. And this is the kind of thing where it's one and done. You just kind of do one pass, let it soak in, and once it's dry, it's going to stay put. And as far as how far up you wax from the bottom, there's a certain amount of that you have to do. Like there's a minimum amount of distance that you want to do so that the glaze comes down, it doesn't kind of fluff out and meet and melt onto the shelf. If your glaze isn't running, you know, 1/8 to 1/16 of an inch is going to be sufficient. But you can also have like a deeper wax depth if you have like an aesthetic reason for it. So with this one, when I waxed it, I just kind of went across the bottom and just did this little bottom edge. But let's say I wanted to fill all these finger marks with wax also, right? And kind of follow that undulating edge. So where you wax it can also become part of the aesthetic motif, right? Or you can kind of grab something with your fingers and trace around them and wax those finger marks so it looks like you dipped it because you want it to kind of have more of the hand of the artist. So there's an opportunity to do some. So that one has the spiral foot underneath. So it has kind of the same relationship to the motif that's going around the bottom of the wall.
Do you wax all of your pieces, all the bottoms?
I tend to. When I'm applying thick glazes, when I'm doing something like a Gersley borate wash where I'm just fluxing the outside surface, but I'm not really applying a thick coat of glaze, that's just a little veneer of powder. So then I can clean that off with a sponge at the end. Because I'm also kind of taking a clean, dry towel and scrubbing it so that it's kind of an uneven application. But when I'm putting on a full thickness glaze like this, I want it to come down to the foot and then stop. So then putting the wax on there allows me to have that ultimate control. It also guarantees that your foot is super clean, no glaze. So as long as you clean up the beaded glaze that's on the wax after you glaze it, then you have nothing kind of on that surface that's touching the shelf. Because some glazes, particularly glazes with a lot of like iron oxide or cobalt, they can kind of get into the pores of the clay and stain it. And that's usually going to be when you see a glaze and you open it and it's like really dark red or dark brown. That's usually an indication that there's an iron oxide component in that glaze, and it'll kind of stain your bisque. Yeah, I mean, part of that is that it depends on what you use to stain it. Some things will leave more pigment in the pores of the clay. Underglazes seem to clean off better than stains. Stains are going to also leave pigment in the pores of the clay, right? So there's no amount of cleaning that's going to get it all the way off. The smoother your wear is, the less of those pores that there are going to be for that to kind of go into. So if you spend a little bit of time burnishing or smoothing with a dry finger the surfaces where you don't want the stain to go, like maybe you go over the high surfaces and kind of burnish and buff it. You could do it with a chamois cloth that's dry potentially. You could do that with your finger. You could do it with the back of a spoon or a river stone. Just kind of depends on how buffed you want it to be. But the smoother it is, the less of that stain is going to go into the pores where you don't want it. In addition to just not getting wax on the work surface. So you kind of leave them upside down until they're dry. Okay, so this one should be ready for me to peel the tape. And I usually peel the tape away from where the glaze is applied and the wax, so that as it does kind of peel the wax away, it doesn't flake as much glaze off. And so now I have the wax going all the way to the edge of where the glaze is applied and not anywhere on the bisque. So I don't have any spots where it's going to be bald. Now that's ready for the second coat of glaze, and it'll have a nice resist where it meets. And for that one, I think I'm gonna do the black, which is this one. Okay. This one is the satin black. So I've done this shiny transparent glaze up here. I want to do something visually texturally different, because when you're mixing mattes and satins, that creates more depth of texture visually, which is going to make the surface more dynamic. So I tend to try to mix transparent, opaque, satin together on one piece to kind of build up more of a visual texture variation, which makes them more interesting to look at. It's also important to note that the glaze that's on top of it. So if you have a runny glaze, putting it on top of a satin or a matte can help arrest it so that it won't run as much. It'll run where it's applied and kind of move, and it'll bleed out, but the satin glaze helps kind of freeze it a little bit more in place, so it has a limited distance that it's going to travel. So you can use those glazes to your advantage to kind of stop it. So I'll tend to do the satin on the bottom of the piece and kind of do runnier glazes up high where it can kind of move down, and then it hits the satin and it'll stop or not go as far, depending on which relationship I've used. And so you can see where the glaze goes past that wax line, it just beads up. So you can go in with a clean sponge and just kind of get those little beads and clean them off.